This is Jay Martin.
Here I am with Jeffrey Sachs. Jeff, it's great to have you back on the program.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so over the last year, 18 months, I've had many conversations on this channel walking through the various geopolitical hotspots with yourself, mutual friends of ours, Pascal Lota, and many other geopolitical brains that I respect. We'd always talk about the Ukrainian front line. We'd always talk about the South China Sea. We'd usually talk about the Middle East. And then as a footnote, we'd touch on the Caribbean and say, there's not a lot happening there, but there's something happening there. Maybe some soft developments, some diplomatic ties occurring between China or Russia and the Caribbean. And this is America's backyard. So it's kind of a thing, but it's not yet. Obviously, fast forward to today, and we see the largest assembly of American military activity in the region in over 30 years, under the guise of President Maduro being involved in drug trafficking, having stolen the election, and the people being oppressed. All of those things might be true, but I have zero confidence that is why the American military is in the Caribbean. How are you reading this situation right now, Jeff? What should people be paying attention to?
Well, it's no secret. Trump wants to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and he wants American companies, or the American government in some way, to own the oil of Venezuela. So this is a pretty blatant, I could say crude, a crude oil play that is so vulgar that it basically is more of a test of us than of Trump. Trump is saying, I'm a Teddy Roosevelt imperialist. I'm going to go grab some property in South America. And everyone's sitting back and saying, yeah, he's probably going to do that. And that's probably what he's going to do. It shows that he's a thug. I don't think we need really to know more than that from him as a personality. He didn't rename the Department of Defense to be the Department of War for no reason. He didn't assemble this carrier strike task force and 100,000 plus military and the largest concentration of power in the Caribbean, as you said, in decades for no reason. And I know also from two Latin American presidents of the past who told me of a dinner that they had with Trump in 2017, where Trump said, why don't I just invade Venezuela? That's 8 years ago. And so he's had this on his mind ever since. Rubio is clearly part of this. Rubio's been in the lead of the campaign against the Venezuelan government, going back to Rubio's days in the Senate, representing Florida, representing arch anti-Maduro voters or arch anti-Cuba voters in South Florida. So this is partly domestic political motivation, but it's mainly to take Venezuela's oil. And seen in the context of a left-wing regime in Venezuela that's been in power for more than 20 years, which said, that's our oil. That's not ExxonMobil and Chevron's oil. And that got the United States really pissed off, if I may say so. Of course, it's our oil, say the U.S. imperialists. And I think Trump is going to prove that.
So, okay, that's interesting, the 2017 comments, and it makes me wonder if that's at all correlated to the oil discovery in Guyana and the subsequent territorial dispute, because that timing kind of lines up a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely is. Guyana is a gusher, and it's a huge oil find, and it's making a lot of money for ExxonMobil. And Venezuela said, hey, this goes back to our territory, if you go back to diplomatic disputes on the borders at the end of the 19th century. And so definitely that's part of the story. But I think it goes beyond the Guyana oil. It goes simply to Trump's view, which is they got a lot of oil. Why don't we take it? And I think that that's what is about to happen. What is completely shocking to me is how quiescent the world is as all of this unfolds.
That is interesting, and I'm curious about that as well. If people just can lazily buy into the narco narrative and say, "Oh yeah, this is good," right? But simultaneously, we're going to offer a pardon to Honduras President Hernandez, who's currently serving time for being convicted importing 400 tons of cocaine into the United States, and we're going to do these things in parallel. Either people don't ask questions, or what's your? Because that kind of it blows up the whole thesis, does it not?
Yes, I don't think people are buying into anything. I think we're benumbed
That's a
these
better way to put
days that, of course, our government lies. Of course, Trump lies. Of course, this is just a power play. But what's interesting is where's the UN? Where's the UN Security Council? Where's the idea that one state cannot threaten another state with military invasion? That seems not to exist right now. So it's more the acquiescence to brazen violence than believing some obviously phony narrative that is at play here. But you don't have any of our leading media writing editorials. We shouldn't go to war. This is terrible. This is illegal. This is something from the 19th century or early 20th century. Nothing like that. You don't have other world leaders saying anything. So, of course, it could be a slight chance that it's all a show to try to brazenly get Maduro to step down or to instigate a coup inside. Well, it's the same thing, regime change, one way or another. But I still find it very, very worrisome that in the year 2025, after everything we know about history and modern history, that there isn't somebody saying, no, you can't just invade another country.
And part of that might be, your point about the UN is that these organizations are tied down in other regions and have been for a few years, and there's only so much bandwidth. United States as well, right? Like it's, they're spread too thin. Let me ask you a question about something I've been kind of noodling around that I'd love to get your perspective on this. So maybe it's the oil, but as I understand, President Maduro has offered up pretty much open access to all of Venezuela's resources under pretty favorable terms, yet he was turned down. And just for context, when we talked about the Honduras President Hernandez, if you weren't aware of that, the former Honduras President Hernandez is in prison in the United States right now for being convicted in a New York court of importing over 400 tons of cocaine into America. This is the president that President Trump is currently debating pardoning. So that's the sort of hypocrisy that we referred to earlier. We're going to call Maduro public enemy number one for being a narco-terrorist while simultaneously pardoning a legitimate narco-terrorist. Doesn't really add up. Also, if you just look at the UN and DEA's own data, Venezuela doesn't play a key role in the American drug trade. It doesn't. You could nuke the country. It wouldn't affect drug prices in the United States. Maybe as a jump-off point to Europe, but it's not precursor chemicals for fentanyl. Those come from China. They're smuggled in through Mexico. Cocaine as well. It's not a key player. So none of this holds up. But something else happened in the Caribbean in the spring and through the summer that I thought might be related. And this is the sort of reemergence of Cuba as a relevant player when the Russians and the Cubans signed the military agreement in, I think it was March. And then in June, some missile-guided submarines and some Navy ships, Russian missile-guided submarines and Navy ships arrived in Cuban waters. 90 miles off, the Florida Keys. And the Russians described this as symmetrical retaliation for the United States' involvement with long-range missiles in Ukraine. Said, you do that here, we'll do that there. And it was 2 months later that we started assembling the biggest military operation in the Caribbean that we've seen in 30 years. And it struck me that if you wanted to cripple the U.S. economy, or if you wanted to make them insecure, you'd focus on the Gulf, obviously, right? This is the mouth of the Mississippi River, the artery of all economic inland activity, and the Gulf itself is the most concentrated value of energy infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, that is the most focused point in the American economy that you got to protect. And they're right next, and that's also in the Caribbean. And I thought, is this maybe related? Because this timeline does add up. But what's your take, Jeff?
Yeah, well, you're making a very good observation, but I would put it in a slightly different way. The Russians, back to the early 1960s, have had a slight presence in Cuba. It was a major presence in October 1962, which almost ended the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis. After that, there remained a Soviet presence in Cuba that was drastically toned down, and it did not involve offensive nuclear weapons, of course. And the United States had pledged not to try to invade Cuba again, as it had done in the Bay of Pigs operation in the spring of 1961, which had set off the course to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this goes back more than 60 years. And the government in Venezuela, a leftist government, which was pro-Cuba also, has a small Russian military contingent in Venezuela, and that's been basically true both with Maduro and before Maduro with his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. So what I do think is going on to some extent is Trump saying to the Russians, this is our sphere of influence, you stay the hell out. But Trump actually is saying to the Russians, and there's a counterpart, we'll basically get out of Ukraine, because that's clearly for you, your sphere of influence in the way that this imperialist mentality thinks. And so I think that there is something related to this. I do think at the core, this is about U.S. complete hegemony and impunity in the Western Hemisphere, an idea which goes back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. And so it's basically the United States saying, we do what we want in our hemisphere. It is very much related to oil. If there were not oil there, there would not be the interest in this issue. And the fight with Chavez and Maduro was a fight about Exxon Mobil and about Chevron and about U.S. claims. So that plays a role. But I think that there's also this smaller subtext that to the Russians, look, we're going to just take out this regime, and we're actually going to basically run the show in the Western Hemisphere, certainly in Central America and the Caribbean. We're going to intervene in Honduran politics. We're going to intervene where we want, when we want. You're not going to bother us. And we're going to tone down what is a much, much greater and direct U.S. provocation vis-a-vis Russia in the case of NATO in Eastern Europe, and especially the attempt at NATO enlargement in Ukraine. So I think that it may be that as we speak with the U.S. envoy, Witkoff, going to Moscow to speak with Putin about U.S. disengagement in Ukraine, that there is a subtext that Russia will stay out of the Western Hemisphere and the United States will do what it wants, and that we won't have noise or even complaints from the Russians in the UN Security Council or any place else about U.S. Impunity in our own region. That seems to me to be pretty much how Trump views the world, which is, yeah, I don't want a war with Russia, probably don't want a war with China, but I don't want them meddling in my stealing whatever I want to steal from my own backyard. And so I think that there is that relationship. Where I would not go as far as you were positing is that there's some real security risk to the United States, or that these are high stakes security issues because of the Gulf of Mexico and our trade. The presence of Russia or China is so tiny in that regard that the U.S. faces no conventional weapons risks at all in the Western Hemisphere, not in any imaginable way. And the only real security risk the United States faces is setting off World War III with nuclear war. Other than that, the U.S. is about the safest country in the history of the world. No one could touch it, invade it, upset it, except for a nuclear war, which could destroy everything. So, but that's not really what's involved in this issue. Bottom line, you're making I think, a correct connection. I don't think it's the primary connection, but there is a connection, which is the U.S. is very blatantly saying we're going to do what we want in our hemisphere. And Trump says that, by the way, vis-a-vis Canada and Greenland also. It's not just the Caribbean or Central America. And Trump is also, I think, although this is more ambiguous and the U.S. government is more ambiguous on this point, signaling to the Russians and to the Chinese, and we won't bother you in your own neighborhood in the same way, which is, in a way, a summary of what the U.S. is saying about Ukraine, which is we're just not interested anymore in pushing NATO into Ukraine. It's too provocative. It's too dangerous. We'll stay out of your backyard. You stay out of our backyard.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, I was thinking through that sort of Cuba as like the cork in the bottle between the Gulf of Mexico and the global markets, the same way you might think about sort of the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf for the OPEC nations. Iran doesn't have to block it. They can just threaten to, and insurance premiums skyrocket and it disrupts trade. Or the South China Sea. China's got an amazing economy, but it lacks direct access to global markets because the South China Sea is bordered by Taiwan and the Philippines, and you need relations with those countries to access global markets. Cuba has been a thorn in America's side, like the Achilles heel. I mean, not really an Achilles heel because it hasn't slowed down the economy, but it's been a point of concern for nearly 100 years.
Yeah, although I wouldn't put it that way. I think it has been it has been viewed more as an insult to America's projection of power. In other words, Cuba is not a threat to the United States, and other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a threat and a very dangerous moment. The fact that the U.S. has kept sanctions on Cuba for the next 60 years is not because the United States is worried about its shipping lanes. It's more that the United States absolutely resents that a regime in our own neighborhood stood up to the United States, a small country, and did not buckle decades ago. So I view it more as a punishment for daring to question the ultimate authority of Uncle Sam, rather than as actually a question of insurance premia or shipping lanes or any danger, because America's capacity to do in any country or force in our region on conventional grounds is basically unlimited.
There's a really important lesson there, right? That it's not like America didn't try regime change in Cuba. It just failed at it. And this small island nation was able to stand up against the hegemon. There's a lesson in there about meddling in Venezuela or Honduras politics, is there not? I mean, if when has regime change worked, it would be the better question to ask. We're looking at Venezuela. That's a very large country. It's a very big country, and maybe the military is in disrepair, but occupation's a really tough game, as we've seen over the last 15, 20 years. It's never really been outright successful. And you'd think there'd be some lessons in there, but here we are.
Yeah, we're dealing with a lot of crude and unsophisticated people who aren't much interested in history. I wouldn't say Trump is listening to the historians very closely. So what is happening right now, in my view, is completely disgusting, unnecessary, costly, illegal, and not going to work in some sense. And you're pointing out that the U.S. regime change operations, which are nonstop, pervasive around the world and have been since the CIA was created in 1947, don't work the vast majority of the time. And I agree with that. And all of this meddling rarely has any kind of benefit, but it ends up creating a huge amount of instability, economic pain, large refugee flows, which the United States purports not to want. After all, the U.S. has had sanctions on Venezuela, now crushing economic sanctions, going back to Obama in 2015, actually, and then greatly intensified by Trump in 2017, 2018, and 2019, which have crushed the Venezuelan economy and led to millions and millions of refugees. So we're already in the regime change operation mode. It hasn't worked yet to actually change the regime. And what history shows is if you actually bring down a leader, you're very unlikely to get a stable new system afterwards. You're much more likely to get a sequence of failed governments, assassinations, coups, civil war, economic failure that continues on a prolonged basis. Something like we've seen in Afghanistan, or in Syria, or in Libya, or in Sudan, each of which is a U.S. regime change operation that failed very, very badly.
Mm-hmm. There's this scenario, I call it like the hammer and the anvil, that's rolling out around the world, where there's a hammer being the United States and the anvil being China. And the hammer's running around swinging at everything, right? And trying to disrupt and trying to change things. But as any metalsmith knows, it's actually the anvil that forms the object, right? The hammer does the work, the object forms around the anvil. And we can look at these sort of trade aggression activities, whether it's sanctions or, sanctions on the Russian economy and on oil exports. That oil doesn't disappear. It now, instead of flowing west to Europe, flows east to China, right? Iran, the same thing. Possibly the largest and deepest oil reserves in the world, at least top three. After sanctioning that oil from the global market, it didn't disappear. It just flows up to China through the dark fleet and the teapot refineries along the coast. And you could say the same thing about Venezuela. But we're seeing a lot of this activity, right, where the hammer's running around swinging wildly and the rest of the world is kind of being pushed to form around the Chinese economy. I spend a lot of my time in Southeast Asia. The demographics are amazing. There's a lot of reasons that we could get into this, why it's the right time to be incredibly optimistic about the East. There's a geopolitical analyst named Peter Zeihan, who I had on the program a couple months ago, and he disputed everything I thought about the Chinese economy, completing with a very bold statement that for demographic reasons, despite everything else that's going on, for demographic reasons, the Chinese economy has about 10 years of competitive edge left. He actually says 10 years left, period, but I'll maybe grace it a bit by saying competitive advantage left. What do you what do you make of a statement like that, Jeff? And like, the demographic crisis is real, but it's not a Chinese problem, it's a global one, or at least a developed country problem. What's your take on a statement like that?
I find it unintelligible and without any basis. China's not in a demographic crisis, by the way. It's in a demographic change. The change over 200 years from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around 1750 to, maybe 1950 or 2000 was very rapid population growth. What happened was mortality rates came down very sharply because of better nutrition and antibiotics and vaccines and healthcare in general. And only with a lag did fertility rates come down alongside the reduced mortality rates. And the result was worldwide a tenfold increase of population from around 800 million people towards the end of the 18th century to 8 billion people today. But what has happened since then is that fertility rates fell everywhere in the world, and in urbanized economies all over the world, the fertility rates fell below 2. That means that mothers were having fewer than 2 children, and that means that each mother would be having statistically less than 1 daughter to replace her in the next generation. And when you reduce the fertility rates below 2, then the population stops rising and it starts declining. And that is what's happening in many parts of the world now, but rather rapidly in Asia, especially East Asia, where the fertility rates are now well below 2, in many places, including China, below 1.5. And the result is that China's population has peaked 2 years ago at about 1.4 billion people, and it will decline. Of course, how far it will decline depends on the fertility rates in future decades, but it could very well decline below 1 billion people. By the UN's forecast, by the end of the 21st century, it could well be below 800 million people. Okay, that's very significant. Is that a crisis? Is that a demographic crisis? Well, I would define a crisis as causing some kind of economic or political or military collapse. And I don't believe that that is what is entailed in a decline of the population, even a significant decline if it's stretched out over 75 years, for example, till the end of this century, especially in the age of AI and robots and so forth. Countries with still rising populations are scratching their heads saying, my God, what's the work going to be in the future? All the work is being replaced by AI systems. And China is on a path for a booming economy that doesn't depend on the size of its workforce. I've actually been in some Chinese factories in recent years that are AI-based factories. I was in one a few months ago outside of Shanghai that was a huge facility for making solar panels, and which the world really needs. And it was cavernous, many football fields in size, and there were almost no workers in it. I was led from station to station of the assembly of the modules in vast quantities, where the machines were doing all the assembly, robots were carrying the semi-finished modules to the next station. AI systems were monitoring everything that was happening when soldering or wiring or something went wrong. The module would go into an off-ramp. And the point was that the entire operation, which is a huge, one of the world's largest operations to make solar modules, doesn't need workers inside. And I've been in other facilities doing other things that are similarly basically being robotized and roboticized and automated in the same way. So China has a vast production capacity, low cost, highly efficient, and not dependent on whether the population's rising or not rising, but it's producing things the world needs. Is that a crisis? I don't think so. Not at all. Will it lead to lower living standards in China? I don't think so. So I don't understand the observation, actually, this idea that human well-being or the viability of the economy depends on a continuing rise of population. That's not even feasible, by the way. To have continued exponential growth of the population, you reach limits that are pretty painful. But a gradually declining population is not a precursor to some kind of economic collapse.
Yeah, I pressed him on it, and I think his take was that it matters more the speed at which the birth rate drops than the birth rate itself, meaning that, and if you correlate the birth rate to urbanization or prosperity, which I think is a fairly accurate thing to do, you look at the United States, you went from sort of homesteading communities to farm communities to suburban to urban, whereas in China, you went from farm communities to urban very quickly, right? And so that cliff is steeper. And I believe that's sort of how he forms his thesis. I'm going to be honest, I did sort of struggle to grasp, and my audience reflected that in the comments of that video. But it was counter to everything I've come to believe about the Chinese economy. And to your point about automation, the Chinese economy today employs over 2 million robots. That's more than the entire world combined. And in 2024,
and not only that, it makes the robots. So that's robot fertility, if I could put it that way. Robots making robots, and the robots are getting better. And if you go to Shenzhen, which is in southern China, just on the border with Hong Kong, and it's now rated, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou is now rated the number one innovation cluster of the whole world. Silicon Valley rated fourth, and so China's rated number one. You can go shop to shop where the new humanoid robots are being produced. There are going to be a lot of them, and they're going to be carrying out all this production. Also really in the service sector, and they're going to be making new robots. So I think they have a pretty good gig going, actually.
What's the robot fertility rate? That's the real question, I think, moving forward. And China did add 300,000 robots in 2024. U.S. added about 32,000, so about 10%, just for context. Your comment there about the manufacturing cluster zones in Guangzhou, Shenzhen being a major one, right? And I know that people are going to be resistant to this idea of, robots taking our jobs. But that's, just to preface that, it's the same argument as if we were to say, should we eliminate mechanized farming and go back to tilling the earth by hand? Would that be good or bad for the cost of food, the abundance of food? Obviously be very bad, right? We'd never go back that direction. But if the idea does not make sense in hindsight, it shouldn't make sense in foresight. We're going to automate and mechanize more. That's absolutely going to happen. And turns out that's improved the quality of our life every single time over a long enough time horizon. Short-term disruption, no question. And on that thread, actually, I have to ask you, are you watching the China youth unemployment rate? Because I believe it's around 20%. It's very high. And I don't understand why. Do you have any take on this, Jeff?
I don't. I don't have any comprehensive sense of whether it's real in terms of actually not working, whether it means part-time work, part-time training and education. But I think that the basic point is that, and by the way, unemployment rates are notoriously difficult to interpret across countries because their meaning is really so different in terms of what activity or lack of activity is entailed in something called unemployment. In many places, it's a lot of informal activity or unregistered activity. In other places, it's really not in the workforce or in education or in training. So the answer to your question is I don't know in any detail different regional unemployment rates within China, but I also do not view this as some kind of unique catastrophe. As often as I travel in China, which is many times a year, this is not the major issue that China is facing. And the major phenomenon that I see when I visit China, again, many times a year, is actually the rather remarkable increase of productivity pretty much across not only the manufacturing, mining, agriculture sectors, so all the goods producing sectors, but also in the service sectors as well. China is a more efficient economy than we see in the United States and Canada. And the innovations that are coming in efficiency are coming a lot faster than we're seeing in our own societies.
And let's touch on that for a minute, because I think it is an important data point when we talk about the reindustrialization of the United States and what America is going to try and do. Because you referenced the specialized economic zones and Shenzhen, Guangzhou being probably the most productive and efficient manufacturing zone in the world. Most of the country has been designated special economic zones. They specialize in whether it's, vehicle, IT, pharmaceutical, and the supply chains are built very strategically with the, refineries right beside the component makers, right beside the transport. Like, it's all built to deliver maximum efficiency at reduced cost. This is a consequence of 30 years of build out. And, they borrowed about $41 trillion to do it. Now, that's important to me because during that same time period, the United States borrowed about $31 trillion. They did not build specialized economic zones. They spent that money on funding foreign wars that they lost, bailing out banks for fraud, and funding stimulus programs that were largely spent on buying those goods from China. But the point of all that is that if the United States is going to try and reindustrialize in today's dollars, you should pay attention to how much it cost China over the last 30 years, because to reindustrialize America to any extent today is going to be so expensive and inflationary that this is the one part of this conversation that nobody's talking about. To truly reindustrialize in any capacity when you're running deficits and debt like the United States is, means a ton of money printing and stimulus. And this is going to be amazingly inflationary to bring any of these industries home again and build out the manufacturing prowess that America wants to. Do you see it that way, Jeff, or do you think I'm missing something here?
Well, I think that the first point is that the U.S. has no plan that could succeed. So there's no strategy. In order to create clusters of high efficiency industry, you need an industrial policy. China has that in many key sectors. The United States does not. The only two sectors where the United States has something like an industrial policy could be AI, where there is a lot of investment, but it's not production. It's design mostly. So it's innovation, but not production, which still takes place in Asia. And the other is the early 20th century oil and gas industry. In other words, 100 years behind the times, and Trump is trying to make an industrial policy of drill, baby, drill. Just what the world doesn't need and where there is no future in that. But when it comes to advanced infrastructure, we don't have strategies or plans. Trump rejects even the idea of moving to a decarbonized energy system, but the world has to do that. Trump rejects moving to an electric vehicle based personal mobility system, but the world needs to do that. So the U.S. doesn't even have a strategy. And recently, Trump mocked Governor Newsom of California for failing to develop fast rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And I just thought, listening to an American president mocking his own country for failing to have fast rail has to be something extraordinarily self-harming. Can you imagine Xi Jinping mocking Guangdong province or Shanghai for not having fast rail? But actually, the deeper truth, of course, is the United States doesn't have 1 kilometer of fast rail, and China has 50,000 kilometers of fast rail. So I think that the issue is not even mainly the cost, because the U.S. could mobilize hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of investment. Of course, it would need a different fiscal policy. It would need a different financial policy. But it doesn't even have the intention to do so. It doesn't have a plan to do so. The whole rhetoric of the U.S. Is basically for the government to be closed down or dysfunctional. We can't even keep our air traffic controllers at work and our skies safe right now, much less build new infrastructure. To build infrastructure requires a forward-looking, consistent plan carried out over 20 or 25 years. But we have no plans like that at all in the United States. We don't have a plan for our power grid. So even when there were new additions to power, say for even the data centers right now, they can't get connected because there's no overall planning capacity or mechanism. We have no Department of Economy. We have no Department of Planning. We have no institutions for it. So this, I think, is the biggest single weakness that the U.S. has, which is other than what used to be some planning and not very good planning in the Pentagon, and some very specific targeted areas where we used to be good, going to the moon or developing the internet. Those are big accomplishments. Those were government accomplishments. We don't have that now. And Trump doesn't even have the concept that this is what a government is supposed to do.
It's when I hear you talk about that, I find myself thinking, this is a democratic problem, right? Now, I'm glad I live in a democratic country, but because we offer our leaders short-term incentives, we're going to reevaluate you every 2 years, if not definitely every 4 years. Therefore, it's in your best interest to promise me something I can have within 2 years, right? Anybody who's ever accomplished something great knows that long-term goals come with short-term sacrifice. That's the trade we make. But nobody's ever going to get elected by promising the population things are going to be really tough for about 6 to 7 years. But it's going to be worth it because on the other side of this, we're going to emerge as one of the most prosperous economies in the world. But you got to put up with this for 5 to 8 years. No one's going to vote for that, and no one's going to reelect that candidate in 4 years when they're in the gully of that pain for the long-term gain, right? Because China has organized their planning into these 5-year plans, and I think we're about to, is it the 15th 5-year plan coming out in 2026?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is what you're talking about. They're very long-term, 5 years at a time, very strategic. It is central planning, and that word is distasteful to a lot of Westerners. but also look at the results. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It just is. It just can be observed.
Well, let me say a few words about that. By the way,
Please.
just a couple of points of to underpin that. First, these are called 5-year plans, but they always have at least a 10-year window. So they're actually beyond 5 years. The plan that will come out in 2026 will go up to 2036. It will be more specifically fashioned for the 5 years, 2026 to 2030, but there will be that added 5-year perspective after that. That will be embedded in essentially a framework that China has to mid-century. So the thinking is even longer term than 10 years because China has aims that are quantified and made explicit in the economic thinking up to 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. So they have institutions that look ahead. There is a question: how could democracies do this? And when I was growing up a long time ago, we had two examples of that, which I, at the time, took to be kind of normal. One was I was 1 year old at the time, but it shows I go back quite a few decades. But in 1955, if you can believe it, the U.S. Voted the interstate highway system. And that was a plan from the Eisenhower administration to build our highway system. We didn't have a highway system. We didn't have Interstate 95 and I-90 and all those I's that crisscross the United States. And most of my youth was watching basically a 25-year project unfold. I remember in my own neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, a long debate about exactly where a piece of that highway would go. We had mile roads because of the way that the Northwest Territories had been marked out already a couple centuries ago. And the question was, would the highway pass 10-mile road or 11-mile road? Well, it meant that there was local politics. It took many years of debate. Finally, it was built. And the point was a whole national system was built during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan administration. It worked. Actually, the plan that was put in place in 1955 said it will be paid for primarily by a gasoline tax. And so they set in motion something that took 25 years. The other one that was not quite as long-term, but a lot more fun, was President Kennedy saying to the Congress in May 1961 that I believe this country should adopt the goal of sending a man to the moon and returning him safely to the earth before the end of this decade. And so we had the moonshot all during my youth. After Kennedy's death in 1963, Johnson continued it. After Johnson, Nixon continued it. And it was 3 presidencies that brought the moonshot to a successful completion when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in the summer of 1969. So we can do these things, actually. They have to be explained to the public. They have to be exciting. Kennedy made it really exciting. He said, we do it not because it is easy, but because it is hard, because it will organize the best of us.
Such a great speech.
Yeah,
that speech
people
so
believed it. The speech at Rice University in 1962. We loved it. This was the greatest thing going. So, we can inspire in a democracy. We can have long-term planning. We can have long-term thinking. The public needs to be honestly engaged in our politics. That's what's disappeared in the United States, by the way. We have no discourse that is honest between our government and the governed. We have true social posts, but we have no We don't even have the idea that a president would give a speech to the American people and lay out a policy. We haven't had Trump explain the Ukraine policy or the Venezuelan policy. We have these absolutely inane Truth Social posts with exclamation points and capital letters and GIFs and things that are unbelievably juvenile, rather than actual responsible governance. So I'm not so pessimistic about the public. I don't find the public the obstacle to good government. I don't find the pandering to the public even working. These leaders that we have are very unpopular. I don't know what they think they're doing, but they're not winning popularity by their short-termism.
That statement you made may summarize, these times better than any I've ever heard. There is no honest discourse between the governors and the governed right now, and that I think anybody is nodding their head in agreement with that, no matter what side of the aisle you sit on or how you feel about whatever issue is making headlines. That is something I think resonates with anybody. And you made, that's really fascinating. 5 to 6 presidents to complete the interstate highway project, 3 presidents to complete the moon landing project, the coordination and long-term cooperation required there. And it struck me that those are both domestic projects. I don't know if that makes a difference, but I see this activity now coming out of the White House that is sort of like, I would call it American capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It's like the emergence of state capitalism in the United States. And this is the rolling treadmill of government deals and private companies, beginning with Nippon Steel. We'll let this merger between Nippon Steel occur and U.S. Steel, but the United States retains a golden share, gives them a lot of veto power in the operation in the U.S., 10% in Intel, 15% equity stake in MP Materials, the rare earth miner and refiner here in the U.S., 10% in Trilogy Metals, the critical metal project in Alaska, and the expansion of the critical metal list from what was 35 metals in 2018 to 60 today. And you could call that a strategy. People might, speak up and say that is the strategy. We're claiming these strategic resources with some government assistance. As an entrepreneur, I see this as like there's been seasons in my journey where I was rich on tactics without a strategy early in my career, and I had lots of activities, lots of tactics, but no strategy, right? So it was all short-term punts, you know what I mean? And after a couple of years of that, you figure out that's what's happening, right? And this kind of strikes me that same way. Lots of short-term punts, no long-term strategy with which they are pointing to, right? What's the North Star? That's very important.
Yes, I think that this is really very important. And to come back to China and this upcoming 15th plan, I have a lot of colleagues, some former students, some people that I work with on other issues at universities throughout China. At Peking University, at Tsinghua University, at Fudan University, and so forth. They are on committees to analyze different sectors. They're talking about the 15th plan in very serious professional ways. This isn't something that's just cooked up by the Communist Party of China, so-called, that is just delivered. This is actually, I can't say an all-of-nation activity, but it's an extraordinarily extensive activity over several years to work on strategies, to debate different approaches. And what's happening at the national level is also happening at the provincial level and at the city level. So Hong Kong is strategizing, Shenzhen is strategizing, Shanghai is strategizing in very open processes that I think would surprise people. The idea that this is, a one-man rule or something else. That's the U.S. That's not China. China is a deeply institutionalized planning process. We don't have that. So it may be that the Commerce Department or someone in the national security agencies have increased the strategic minerals list to 60 and so on. But it's so poorly formed, so much lack of process analysis, and so much corruption involved in it also, because my God, the president has to have his own family engaged in these mining deals, for heaven's sake. Can you imagine? It's a shocking thing. But it's not systematic, because there is no place for systematic thinking. And we used to have something called the U.S. Congress. I think it's still around, but I don't hear much of it anymore. But there used to be hearings. You'd go as an expert. You would talk, discuss. You would be asked honest questions from Congress. I used to participate in that decades ago. But that also has disappeared. So the idea that the government would have a white paper, a strategic paper, that it would have a plan, that it would be vetted and publicly debated, that it would be put into a legislative framework. These are quaint ideas now. It doesn't exist. We don't have the ministries for them. We don't have the processes. We don't have the intentionality. We don't have the honesty, because so much is wrapped up in insider deals that are simply personal corruption, not public policy, that this overwhelms the process, and it also makes it impossible to have an honest discussion about any of this. It's all insider plays, and therefore you can't really put out in some honest analytical way what the issues are.
So I know we're bumping up against our time here, but to kind of cap this, I have two things I want to say, and one is, what is the vulnerable point in the Chinese economy? And my assumption would be that maybe it's President Xi. And I appreciate everything you just said about the sort of collective input to these 5-year plans through a variety of professionals and institutions. I also look at the purges that we noticed at the 4th plenary session a month ago. This is the planning session of the 15th 5-year plan. A lot of military leaders were absent. A lot of people just don't seem to show up. And it's speculation. I have no idea why. But maybe there's some internal purges happening in the government. And also, obviously, the abandonment of term limits leads you to think, what happens after Xi, though, right? What happens after this leader? And quite frankly, I was remembering, I'm Canadian, so I can go to Cuba. And I was there in the early 2000s. And I remember chatting with just my waiter. And I was going back and forth about, Cuban culture. And one question I asked was, what happens after Castro dies? And he's like, we'll have a funeral. Like, business as usual, right? We go back to work. Nothing changes. And that's proven true, right? It's kind of what happened, exactly what happened. But in the West, we make a lot more of this, right? What is going to happen after Castro? It's like, well, everyone goes back to work. Same thing I would do, right? I'd go back to work. Do you think there's any validity in what would you see as the vulnerable point in the Chinese economy? And then secondly, well, let's start there because that's a big one.
Yep.
And then
I personally don't see the system as so personalistic from everything that I see. When I meet with Chinese officials, they are extremely well trained and extremely well experienced. And there is what has been true, I think, in China for 2 millennia. It's also true in other places in East Asia. There is a kind of pyramid that to climb the ladder of power, you prove yourself at a lower level. So you meet a provincial leader, someone who's head of a province or head of a special administrative region. If they have to do a good job to get to the next level of authority in China. And when you meet a senior official at the state council or in a regional government, they've already been through 5 or 6 ranks in that hierarchy. They were a mayor, basically, or they were a senior party official at the local level. Then they did a good job, and then they were promoted. And then they were promoted again. Then they were promoted to provincial level. Then they would be called to Beijing. This is a system. It's not a personalized or nepotistic system. It is a system in which promotion is based on observed performance. And it has a tremendous success in having very seasoned, experienced managers who typically are engineers professionally, reaching the top levels in China. I've seen in the last year some of the, and met with some of the likely next very senior appointments, and I was extremely impressed with them.
They just wrapped up. Is it called the Gaokao examination process in China, which is it's like nationwide examinations.
Oh, yeah.
And a number of entries versus endpoints. Like, what do you know about this examination process, Jeff? Anything you can?
Well, one thing I will tell you is that it's 2,000 years old, because
Right.
It was the Han Dynasty around 140 BC, if I'm not mistaken. I may be, but that's what I recall, which introduced the examination system. Of course, at the time and for a very long time, well over 1,000 years, the test was on selected Confucian texts. Now it's a different system, but to become part of the civil service was a rigorous examination that meant that any young person in any remote village of China throughout history could aspire to become a mandarin, could aspire to become a senior official. Similarly, to get into the major universities is also an exam system, objective, grueling, very competitive, and that is why my experience is that the young people that I've taught from China at Harvard and at Columbia University have been absolutely outstanding, because by the time that they pass through the Beida exam system or the Tsinghua University exam system, they were exceptional. And so this is a very meritocratic system in place, and it is not a personalistic system.
Yeah, you stole the words right out of my mouth there. When you analyze this system, it is incredibly meritocratic, which is, again, opposes maybe many assumptions that people in the West make about China. I'll maybe cap it there today. I have lots more I'd love to talk to you about, but this has been very insightful, and I appreciate your time, Jeff. So thank you, because I know you're incredibly busy.
Great to be with you. We'll do it again. We'll do it again. I hope early in 2026.
All right, sounds good. Safe travels wherever you're off to next. And once again, I appreciate it, Jeff.